Tonight, we journey back through centuries to a world of silk and shadows, where lives were lived in whispers, and names were forgotten before they were ever truly spoken. This is the story of a woman whose identity was erased from history, but whose memory we can still touch if we listen carefully enough. Her name is no longer spoken. Not in the palace where she lived for decades. Not in the city where she was born. Even the records in the Imperial archives list her only as Concubine, rank 7, autumn selection. But tonight, we remember. What I'm about to tell you is not a fairy tale. It is not a romance. It is the quiet truth of a system that consumed young women like kindling and left behind only ashes and silence. Some stories whisper their horrors so softly that we almost miss them. This is one of those stories. Let us begin in a village whose name has also been lost to time. A place where morning mist clung to rice fields, where the sound of water wheels turned with the patience of centuries, where a girl named, but no, her name was taken from her so completely that even I cannot speak it here. She was the third, daughter of a farmer whose land was small but fertile. Her mother wove cloth in the evenings by candlelight, her fingers moving with the rhythm of generations. Her father grew vegetables that fed the local market, honest work that left his hands permanently stained with earth dot in this village. Girls were taught to be useful, to cook, to clean, to tend the sick, to bear children. But this particular girl was different. She could read. Her grandmother, a woman of unusual education, had taught her characters by candlelight, whispering stories of distant places and ancient queens. The reading would later be seen as both blessing and curse. In the palace, educated concubines were valued for their ability to entertain with poetry and conversation. But education also meant awareness. And awareness in a place designed to strip away identity was a form of torture. She was 16 when they came. Officials in red robes, their eyes sharp and calculating, moving through the village like merchants appraising goods at market. But these weren't merchants. They were collectors. Collectors of young women for the Imperial harem. The selection process was methodical, brutal in its efficiency. They examined girls like livestock. Teeth were checked for straightness. Skin was inspected for blemishes. Hands were examined for calluses that might indicate too much manual labor. They measured heights, recorded ages, noted the shape of eyes, and the quality of hair. Her mother whispered urgently, "Hide your face," but it was already too late. She had grown tall that summer, her body changing in ways that made her mother weep at night. Her skin, they noted in their ledgers, was like porcelain, her eyes downcast and obedient. Everything the palace required dot. What they didn't record was the way she helped her younger siblings with their lessons, the way she sang lullabies to calm a crying baby, the way she could make anyone laugh with her gentle humor. These things had no value in their ledgers. The night before she was taken, her mother sat beside her bed and spoke in whispers. "Remember who you are," she said. "Remember where you come from. No matter what they do to you, remember that you are my daughter, that you are loved, that you have a name." But remembering, as she would learn, was itself a form of rebellion. And rebellion in the palace was not tolerated. The journey to the capital took 3 weeks. 37 girls, ages 14 to 19, traveling in covered carts that smelled of fear and unwashed bodies. They were not allowed to speak to each other. They were not allowed to look outside. The first few days, some girls wept. The guards would bang on the side of the cart when the crying grew too loud. "Silence," they would shout. "Learn it now or learn it harder later." By the second week, the crying had stopped. Not because the sadness had ended, but because the girls had learned their first lesson in palace survival. Grief was a luxury they could no longer afford. That our forgotten concubine spent those weeks trying to memorize the faces of her fellow travelers. She somehow understood, even then, that memory would become her most precious possession. She studied the way one girl braided her hair, the way another hummed under her breath, the way a third would trace characters in the dust with her finger. She didn't know then that most of these girls would be dead within 5 years, not from illness or accident, but from the slow death of spirit that the palace specialized in. Some would fade away like candles in the wind. Others would make fatal mistakes, a wrong word, a jealous glance, a moment of defiance. The palace, you see, was not designed for the concubines to thrive. It was designed for them to survive just long enough to serve their purpose, then disappear, without causing trouble. On the final day of travel, they could smell the capital before they could see it. Smoke from 1,000 cooking fires, the scent of incense from countless temples, the particular smell of too many people living too close together, and underneath it all, something else, something that made the horses nervous and the guards grip their weapons tighter, not fear. The city smelled of fear. The forbidden city rose before them like a mountain of gold and red, its walls so high they seemed to touch the clouds. The girls pressed their faces to the small windows of their carts, seeing their future home for the first time. What they saw was beautiful. What they couldn't see was the invisible prison being built around them with every step closer to those magnificent gates. The first shock was the silence, not the absence of sound, but the weight of it. In the palace, silence was a living thing that pressed against your chest, that made your heartbeat sound like thunder in your ears. They were separated immediately. The girls who had traveled together, who had shared their terror and their hope, were divided by rank and potential. Our concubine was classified as ranked 7, not the lowest, but far from the highest. High enough to hope, low enough to know. That hope was probably foolish. The room she was assigned was smaller than the chicken coop back in her village. She shared it with 4 other girls, their sleeping mats so close together that she could hear their dreams and nightmares, their whispered prayers and muffled sobs. The hierarchy was explained to them on their first morning, not with words, but with actions. They watched as a girl who had spoken too loudly at breakfast was led away by eunuchs. She returned hours later, her face blank, her spirit visibly broken. She never spoke above a whisper again. The lessons began immediately. How to bow at precisely the right angle. Too shallow showed disrespect, too deep showed presumption. How to speak only when spoken to, and then only in voices soft as silk. How to make themselves invisible while somehow remaining available. They learned that one wrong word could travel down corridors faster than a courier on horseback. That a look held too long could be interpreted as seduction or defiance, both equally dangerous. That in this palace smiles were weapons and compliments, were traps, but perhaps the cruelest lesson was this. They were taught to compete with each other. Food was limited, privileges were scarce, and the emperor's attention was the ultimate prize. The girls who had comforted each other during the journey were now potential enemies. Our concubine watched as friendships died under the weight of this system. She watched as girls who had been kind became cruel, as the generous became miserly, as the trusting became suspicious. The palace had a way of bringing out the worst in people, because the worst was often what survival required. Every evening, as the sun set behind the palace walls, the eunuchs would make their rounds. They carried lanterns and lists, and somewhere on those lists was a name. One name. That girl would be dressed in her finest robes, her hair arranged in perfect coils, and she would be escorted barefoot across the cold marble to the emperor's chamber. What happened in the emperor's chamber was never spoken of directly, but the girls who returned were different. Some came back with gifts and elevated status. Others came back broken, their eyes holding secrets too terrible to share. And some never came back at all. Our concubine's name was never called. For 3 years she waited and watched as other girls were chosen, used, and discarded. She began to understand that invisibility, which she had been taught to cultivate, had become her protection. The palace had a way of making you grateful for neglect. It was a terrible thing to be thankful for, but gratitude was sometimes the only thing that kept you sane. There were things that happened in the palace that were never recorded in any official history, things that were whispered about in the darkest corners of the sleeping quarters, when the guards were far away and the night was deep. Girls disappeared, not dramatically, not with fanfare, but quietly, in the way that a candle flame simply stops burning. One day they would be there. The next day their sleeping mat would be empty, their belongings gone. The official explanations were always the same: illness, family emergency, reassignment to another part of the palace. But the girls knew better. They knew that illness often meant pregnancy by someone other than the emperor. They knew that family emergency meant asking too many questions or showing too much independence. And reassignment was the most terrifying of all, because sometimes, late at night, you could hear screaming from the deep parts of the palace. Screaming that stopped suddenly, completely, as if cut off by a blade. There were guards who took liberties that were ignored by their superiors. There were eunuchs who weren't as complete as they were supposed to be. There were officials who visited the concubine quarters for reasons that had nothing to do with imperial business. The girls learned to make themselves ugly when certain people were around. They learned to hunch their shoulders, to let their hair fall across their faces, to develop sudden limps or coughs that made them less appealing. Our concubine developed a particular skill. She could make herself forgettable, not invisible. Invisibility implied you were noticed and then dismissed. She became forgettable, as if she had never been there at all, but being forgettable came with its own horror. It meant that when girls around her disappeared, she was never questioned. She was never considered important enough to have seen or heard anything worth investigating. The girl who had slept on the mat next to hers for 2 years vanished on a Tuesday. Her name was May, and she had been kind to everyone, sharing her meager food rations and offering comfort to the younger girls. She had made the mistake of teaching a few of them to read, using characters drawn in the dust of the courtyard. May's disappearance was explained as a family emergency, but her family lived 300 miles away, and she had never received a letter from them. The other girls knew what had really happened. May had been deemed too influential, too likely to inspire thoughts of independence. That night, our concubine lay on her mat and stared at the empty space where May had slept. She made a decision that would define the rest of her life in the palace. She would never again let herself care too much about another person. Caring was dangerous. Caring got you noticed. Caring got you killed. It was a decision that saved her life and destroyed her soul. The palace had a way of making you complicit in your own destruction. It gave you just enough small comforts, an extra bowl of rice, a softer sleeping mat, a few minutes of sunlight in the courtyard to make you grateful. And gratitude in that place was a form of betrayal. Betrayal of yourself, of your dreams, of the girl you had been before you learned to be nothing. 3 years passed like seasons in a dream. Spring brought cherry blossoms that fell like snow in the courtyards, beautiful and brief. Summer brought the heavy scent of jasmine and the sound of cicadas in the evening. Autumn painted the leaves gold and red, while winter wrapped the palace in a silence deeper than sleep. But the seasons, beautiful as they were, began to feel like a trap. Each spring that returned was another year of her life lost. Each autumn that came was another year of youth fading in service to a man who had never seen her face. She learned to embroider, silk so delicate it seemed to capture light itself. Her fingers moved with practiced precision, creating flowers that would never fade, birds that would never fly. She memorized poetry verses about love she would never know, about freedom she would never taste. The poetry was perhaps the cruelest part. She was required to memorize love songs written by women who had been trapped in similar circumstances. Songs about longing and desire, about the beauty of romance and the joy of being chosen by a powerful man. She had to speak these words with conviction, even as they tasted like ash in her mouth. In the gardens, she walked beneath ancient trees, listening to the whisper of leaves, the distant sound of water over stones. Sometimes she would sit by the lotus pond and watch the fish move in slow, graceful circles beneath the surface. The fish, she realized, were as trapped as she was. They lived in a beautiful prison, fed and cared for, but never free. She watched other girls rise in rank. She watched them fall from grace. One girl, Lian, became favored for a brief, shining moment. She bore the emperor a son, and for a while we all feared her. She walked like a queen through the very courtyards where she had once bowed to others, but the child died in his sleep after only a month. The official cause was given as sudden illness, but the girls knew better. A male heir from a low-ranking concubine was a threat to the established order. There were too many people who benefited from that child never growing up. Lion stopped speaking after that. Not gradually, not slowly, but completely. One day she was chattering about her sons. First smile, and the next day she was mute. They moved her to the far western wing, where she no longer received visitors, where she no longer mattered. Sometimes our concubine would see Lian in the gardens, sitting motionless beneath the same tree for hours. Lian's eyes had become like empty windows, as if the person who had once lived behind them had simply left. The palace had a way of killing people while leaving their bodies alive. It was more efficient than actual murder, and it left no evidence for future historians to find uncomfortable. Our concubine began to understand that the palace was not just a place of confinement. It was a machine designed to break human spirits. With precise, methodical efficiency, every rule, every ritual, every small cruelty was carefully calibrated to destroy hope without destroying the ability to serve. And she began to realize that she was succeeding in ways she had never wanted to succeed. She was becoming exactly what the palace wanted: invisible, compliant, grateful for scraps, and completely without hope for anything better. The outside world became a memory, then a dream, then finally just a word without meaning. Letters were inspected by eunuchs with eyes like hawks. Visits from family were rare as eclipses and twice as brief. She tried to write home many times. The first letter was full of descriptions of the palace's beauty, carefully worded to avoid any hint of unhappiness. She wrote about the gardens, about the way morning light fell through paper windows, about the sound of rain on tile roofs. The eunuch read it slowly, folded it carefully, and told her it was too descriptive. It might, he explained, reveal too much about the palace's layout to potential enemies. It was never sent. The second letter was shorter, more careful. She wrote about missing her family, about hoping they were well, about the changing seasons. This one was rejected for being too emotional. Emotions, she was told, were inappropriate. For a concubine's correspondence, by the 10th letter she had learned to write like a stranger. She mentioned the weather, asked about the harvest, included stilted phrases about honor and duty. This letter was approved and sent, but when she imagined her mother reading it, she knew it would be like receiving a letter from a ghost. The replies, when they came, were equally strange. Her mother's natural warmth had been filtered through the same censorship, leaving behind only polite inquiries about her health and dutiful expressions of pride in her service to the emperor. After 5 years, the letters stopped coming entirely. She never knew if her parents had died, if they had been forbidden to write, or if they had simply forgotten her. In the palace, forgetting was sometimes the kindest thing that could happen. That night, she lay in her narrow bed and tried to remember her mother's face, but the memory had grown soft around the edges, like a painting left too long in the sun. She wondered if her mother still waited for letters that would never come. She wondered if her mother still remembered her name. The cruelest part was not knowing. Death would have been a clean break, a defined end to hope. But this was like being erased while still breathing. The emperor was everywhere and nowhere. His presence filled the palace like incense, invisible but inescapable. Yet in 15 years of living in his home, our concubine never once saw him clearly. She glimpsed him occasionally, from a distance. A figure in yellow robes moving across a distant courtyard, surrounded by guards and advisors. Sometimes she would see the shadow of his sedan chair passing behind silk screens. Once she heard his voice from 3 rooms away, discussing trade routes with his ministers. But he was never real to her. How could he be? He was less a person than a concept, a force of nature that shaped her life without ever acknowledging her existence. The other girls spoke of him with a mixture of longing and terror. They created elaborate fantasies about what it would be like to be chosen, to be noticed, to be loved by the most powerful man in the empire. But our concubine began to understand that love was not what happened in the emperor's chambers. The girls who were chosen and returned spoke little of their experiences, but their eyes told stories of things that had nothing to do with love. They moved differently afterward, as if something inside them had been broken and imperfectly repaired. She began to realize that she was not waiting to be chosen. She was waiting to be used. And perhaps her greatest fortune was that she was not beautiful enough, not interesting enough, not unfortunate enough to catch the emperor's attention. Time became fluid in the palace. Days blended into weeks, weeks into months, months into years. She aged without ever being seen. Her face changed without ever being noticed. The emperor lived and ruled from his distant throne, a figure as remote as the stars. She was 39 when he died. She had never once spoken to him. She had never once been in the same room as him. She had lived her entire adult life in service to a man who never knew her name, never saw her face, never acknowledged her existence in any way. When the news of his death reached the concubine quarters, she felt nothing. Not sadness, not relief, not even curiosity about what would happen next. She felt nothing, and that nothingness was perhaps the most tragic thing of all. With the emperor's death came a new chapter in her story, though chapter suggests movement, progression, hope. What came next was more like a slow fade to white. She was moved to the quiet hall where widowed concubines were housed. The name was apt. Here silence wasn't just expected, it was absolute. They wore white now, the color of mourning, the color of ghosts. The quiet hall was where the palace sent its living dead, women who had outlived their usefulness, who had survived long enough to become inconvenient reminders of previous reigns. They were fed, clothed, and housed, but they were not expected to live. They were expected to simply fade away. Their hair was no longer adorned with pins of jade and gold. Their robes were simple, undecorated. They had become invisible even to themselves, which was perhaps the palace's final mercy. In the quiet hall, days passed like prayers whispered in an empty temple. She would sit by her window and watch the seasons change in the small courtyard below. The same cherry tree bloomed and shed its petals year after year. The same birds nested in its branches. The same shadows moved across the ground as the sun traveled its ancient path. Sometimes she would remember the girl she had been in her village. That girl had laughed. That girl had dreamed of marriage, of children, of a life filled with ordinary sorrows and ordinary joys. But that girl felt like someone she had heard about in a story, not someone she had been. The women in the quiet hall rarely spoke to each other. What was there to say? They had all lived the same life, made the same sacrifice, received the same reward, obscurity. They were like books that had been read and shelved, their stories complete but forgotten. But sometimes, late at night, she would hear weeping from the other rooms. Quiet, careful weeping that spoke of grief too deep for words. These women were mourning not just the emperor, but their own lives, their own lost possibilities, their own forgotten names. She never wept. She had learned long ago that tears were a luxury she could not afford. But sometimes in the deepest part of the night, she would feel a hollowness in her chest that was worse than any pain. In her final years, she spent more and more time in the garden. There was a corner of the courtyard where no one else went, a place where the gardeners had planted herbs for the palace kitchens. Mint grew there, and basil, and small flowers whose names she never learned. She would sit among the herbs and breathe in their scent, trying to remember the smell of her mother's cooking, the taste of food prepared with love rather than ceremony. The mint reminded her of tea shared with friends she would never see again. Sometimes she would pick a few leaves and crush them between her fingers, releasing their essence into the air. It was a small rebellion, perhaps the only one she ever allowed herself. The palace had taken her name, her freedom, her future, but it could not take away her ability to smell mint and remember what it felt like to be loved. The younger women in the quiet hall whispered that she was becoming strange, that she talked to the plants, that she smiled at nothing. But she wasn't talking to the plants. She was talking to the memories that lived in the scent of mint and basil, in the feel of earth beneath her fingernails, in the sound of bees humming among the flowers. She was talking to the girl she had been, the woman she might have become, the life she had never lived. And in those conversations, she found something that the palace had tried to destroy. She found herself Dot in the garden, surrounded by living things that grew and changed and died according to their own natural rhythms. She began to understand that the palace had failed in its ultimate purpose. It had tried to erase her, but she was still here, broken, perhaps, forgotten, certainly, but still here. The records say she died in her sleep on a spring morning when the cherry blossoms were in full bloom. She was 63 years old. She had lived in the palace for 47 years longer than she had lived anywhere else, longer than she had known her own family. They found her in the garden among the herbs, her fingers still stained with mint. She was smiling, the servants said, though no one could imagine what she had found to smile about. But perhaps she was smiling because she had remembered something the palace had tried to make her forget. Perhaps she was smiling because she had found a way to be free while still being trapped. Perhaps she was smiling because she had managed to keep a small part of herself hidden away, safe from the machine that had tried to destroy her. They buried her in an anonymous tomb beneath the earth of a garden she had never walked in. Her name was not carved in stone. Her achievements were not recorded. Her story was not told. The tomb was small, simple, a rectangle of earth, marked only by a number in the palace records. Number 247, that was all she had become in the end. A number in a ledger, a space in the ground, a memory that no one kept. But the earth above her grave was fertile. Grass grew there, and wildflowers, and eventually a small tree took root. The tree grew slowly, as trees do, reaching toward the sky with patient persistence. The gardeners who tended the cemetery noticed something unusual about that particular tree. It bloomed earlier than the others, and its flowers had an unusual fragrance, sweet and herbal, like mint and jasmine mixed together. They couldn't explain it, but they left the tree alone, sensing something sacred in its presence. And perhaps, in some way, that tree became her monument. Not carved in stone, not inscribed with words, but living, breathing, growing. A life that had been constrained by walls and rules and silence had become, in death, something wild and free. The tree is still there, according to the records, still growing, still reaching toward the light, still blooming with that strange, sweet fragrance that no one can quite explain. Sometimes, visitors to the cemetery report seeing a figure in white robes sitting beneath the tree, always at dawn, always facing east toward the rising sun. But when they approach, There is nothing there except the scent of mint and the sound of wind through leaves. Years later, when the palace fell and the new dynasty took power, investigators would uncover the truth about the concubine system. Hidden in secret archives, they found records that the empire had tried to destroy. The numbers were staggering. Over 3 centuries, more than 50,000 young women had been brought to the palace as concubines. Of those, fewer than 100 had ever borne children to the emperor. Fewer than 50 had ever achieved any significant rank or influence. Rest had simply disappeared into the machinery of the palace, their lives consumed to feed a system that existed not to serve the emperor's pleasure, but to demonstrate his power. The concubine system was not about love or even desire. It was about control over women, control over families, control over the very concept of human worth. The investigators found evidence of systematic abuse, of murders disguised as accidents of a network of corruption that reached into every level of palace administration. They found records of girls as young as 12 being selected for the emperor's harem, and accounts of mass graves where the bodies of concubines were disposed of when they became inconvenient. They found letters that had never been sent, thousands of them expressing love and longing and despair. They found diaries hidden in walls, telling stories of suffering that had never been officially acknowledged. They found evidence of a Holocaust that had been hidden behind silk curtains and golden walls. But perhaps most damning of all, they found evidence that the emperors themselves were often unaware of the extent of the system's cruelty. The palace had created a machine so efficient at hiding its own brutality that even those who benefited from it never fully understood what they were complicit in. The investigators tried to compile a list of names to give identity back to the women who had been reduced to numbers. But the records were incomplete, deliberately destroyed, or never kept in the first place. Most of the women remained nameless, their individual stories lost forever. Our concubine was one of them. Number 247 in the ledger. No name, no story, no memorial. Just a number and a date of death. The investigators planted a garden on the site of the old palace with a single plaque that read, "In memory of the unnamed, in honor of the forgotten, in recognition of the cost of silence." The story of the concubine system did not end with the fall of the palace. Its echoes can be heard in every society that has ever reduced human beings to commodities, in every system that has ever hidden its brutality behind beauty and tradition. The palace was not unique in its cruelty. It was simply more efficient, more organized, more complete in its dehumanization. But the same impulses that created the concubine system exist wherever power is concentrated and accountability is absent. Today, we tell ourselves that such things could not happen in our modern world. We have laws, we have international oversight, we have human rights organizations. But the truth is more complicated and more uncomfortable. The young women who disappear into human trafficking networks, who are promised good jobs and better lives, and instead find themselves trapped in systems of exploitation, they are the modern concubines. The children who work in factories, who are told they are providing for their families, but who never see the profits of their labor. They are the modern palace servants. The palace may have fallen, but the machinery of exploitation continues to turn. It simply wears different clothes, speaks different languages, hides behind different justifications that our concubine's story is not just about the past. It is about the present, about the future, about the eternal human capacity to treat other humans as less than human when it serves our purposes. But it is also about the eternal human capacity to endure, to maintain dignity in the face of dehumanization, to find ways to be free even while trapped. The mint she crushed between her fingers, the memories she refused to abandon, the small tree that grew from her grave, these are acts of resistance against forgetting. Tonight you remember her. In your mind's eye, perhaps you see a girl in blue silk, seated near a window, watching plum blossoms fall with a kind of quiet sadness. You see the delicate world behind the palace walls, the life that was lived but never truly owned. She was one of thousands, thousands of women whose names were erased, whose stories were forgotten, whose lives were lived in the spaces between history's grand narratives. But in remembering her, we remember them all. Her story is not unique, but it is hers. And now it is yours to carry forward, to whisper to the darkness, to keep alive in the garden of memory where no name is ever truly lost. The palace tried to erase her, but it failed. Because here, in this moment, as you listen to these words, she exists again. She breathes again. She matters again. The machine that tried to destroy her has become dust, but her story lives on. Let her rest there in your thoughts. Let her sit by her window, watching the blossoms fall. Let her walk in her garden, crushing mint between her fingers. Let her find in your remembering the peace that eluded her in life. Some lives are loud, some stories demand to be told. But this story asks only to be remembered quietly, gently, like a prayer whispered in an empty temple. The tree still grows above her grave, still blooms with that strange, sweet fragrance, still reaches toward the light. And in that reaching, in that persistence, in that refusal to surrender to the darkness, we find something that no palace can destroy. We find hope. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering. Thank you for keeping her story alive, for adding your voice to the chorus of those who refuse to let her be forgotten. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere in a garden of memory, a young woman sits by her window, no longer alone, no longer forgotten, no longer just a number in a ledger. She has a name now. She has a story. She has you to remember her.